Welcome to Ideas of India, a podcast where we examine academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and today my guest is Milan Vaishnav, who is a senior fellow and the director of the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is also the author of the book When Crime Pays: Money and Muscle in Indian Politics, and the host of the Grand Tamasha podcast. We discussed Milan's recent report that explores how Indian Americans view India, co-authored with Sumitra Badrinathan and Devesh Kapoor. We talked about Indian Americans as a group, how they think about politics in India versus the United States, their political clout, and so on. We also spoke about Milan's views on the Indian state and the BJP, his intellectual influences, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit discoursemagazine.com. Hi Milan, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Shruti.
I know, it's so good to see you. We live very close to each other geographically, but of course we're doing this on Zoom and hopefully we can do this in person soon enough.
Well, in the intervening year, you have become a podcast maven. So I'm a big fan of the podcast, so it's great to be on.
Oh, thank you. So now this is going to sound like a mutual admiration club, but I'm also a big fan of your podcast. So I guess, this should be interesting. How do two podcasts talk with each other in these troubling times? So this is a good experiment.
We've joked that, we're going to get Amit Verma and the three of us are going to do a joint show at some point. So that will be the podcast to end all podcasts.
I know. The last time I did one with Amit, it ended up being 5 hours long.
Yeah, I don't know if I have the stamina for 5 hours.
I recently read your report. This is the one that you have co-authored with Sumitra Badrinathan and Devesh Kapoor, and it's called How Do Indian Americans View India? And these are the results from one of the surveys that you conducted last year, just before, the US elections. And one of the fascinating results from the survey is that the Indian diaspora doesn't quite fit in the standard political left-right axis. So can you first tell me a little bit about the survey and, then we can maybe parse through some of the results?
Yeah, it was last summer, Shruti, that Sumitra, Devesh, and I, had a conversation. It was actually the kind of latest in a series of ongoing conversations where we thought we're really eager to know how Indian Americans are thinking about the US election. And we just decided to take the plunge and to try to field a survey. And so we partnered with YouGov, which is, a leading data analytics and survey firm. I'm sure many of your listeners are aware. They partnered with The Economist for the US presidential election. So they had a kind of weekly tracker. And so we did a online survey using YouGov's existing panel of 1,200 Indian American adult residents. Crucially, this includes both US citizens and non-citizens, because of course the Indian American community consists of both types. And the idea really was very simple, just to try to put together new empirical data that could help us characterize, the views, the attitudes, the preferences of Indian Americans. Our primary objective going in was, we have a presidential election coming up. There was actually a lot of conjecture about Indian Americans. They have traditionally leaned Democratic, that they might be defecting to the Republican Party. So we wanted to investigate that. But I would say the second big objective for us was, there have been surveys of how Americans view India, of how Indians view America, but no one has ever really asked Indian Americans how they view India. And I think there's emerged over the past, 5 or 6 years, a kind of consensus view about Indian Americans, how they view Modi quite favorably, how they view political changes underway there also quite favorably. And we wanted to really test those propositions and also try to understand, to the extent possible, a little bit about the variation, right? I mean, there is no one Indian American community. It's obviously reflective of all of the divisions that the community brings. That includes, class, right? Whether you were born here, whether you're an immigrant, where you live, and so on and so forth. So that's really kind of the setup.
This is fascinating also because this group is changing so quickly, both in terms of its size and its composition, that we really actually don't know that much about the Indian American. I mean, the old view is they are typically Hindu, upper caste, and engineers and doctors, right? But now this group is really large. It's all just a little over 4 million people, and two-thirds of the 4 million have arrived here after 2008, much like me, right? And now it's a much broader group, both in terms of, religious representation, caste representation, as you mentioned, whether they're, naturalized or they're not US citizens yet. And I believe there's a really small fraction, which is even third generation, that is now represented in your sample. So one of the fascinating results from the survey is that, the standard left-right distinctions don't really cross over. Right. From the first version of the report that you released last year, we learned that Indians are overwhelmingly, voting for the Democratic Party. But among those who approve of Trump, right, 68%, I believe, also approve of Modi. And that sort of makes sense. But even the respondents who disapprove of Trump, a very large number of those still approve of Modi's performance. So being on sort of the left or, left side of American politics in terms of partisan politics doesn't translate exactly one-on-one with supporting, left of center parties in India.
It's a really fascinating puzzle that, we're still trying to wrap our heads around. But, just to kind of give your listeners sort of flavor of what we found, it is certainly true that Modi is most popular amongst Indian Americans who identify as Republicans and who voted for Trump in this most recent presidential election. However, there's a kind of common refrain that, okay, if you're pro-Trump, then you're pro-Modi, and if you're anti-Trump, you're anti-Modi, and that's not the case. As you say, there are a number of people who did not vote for Trump, who are Democrats, who voted for Joe Biden, who are favorable about Modi.
So why is this? Is it because, it's more about the individual that is Modi, and, whether you support Biden or not, Modi is just such a strong leader and so sort of, so much the face of India that Indian Americans tend to support him? Or is it just that, the love for the homeland may automatically translate to whoever is in power, or is something else going on?
So I think there's a couple of things, right? Number one is clearly that Indian Americans, just like Indians themselves, have a very low rating of Congress and Rahul Gandhi, right, which is the principal opposition. And so you might think, well, Democrats would be more bullish perhaps on the Congress. And it's true, they are, but they still rate Modi, the BJP. And interestingly, the RSS, which is the kind of course, ideological kind of fountainhead of the BJP, they rate all of those organizations above the Congress and Rahul Gandhi. So I think, the kind of collapse of alternatives that we talk about so much in Indian context, I think is very much present here. But I think secondly, if you think about what are the issues that really animate Indian Americans insofar as India is concerned, the kinds of issues they talk about are corruption, revitalizing the economy, jobs. These are precisely the things that Modi, at least rhetorically, has spent a lot of time talking about, right? I think there's a sense, and I'm drawing here on my own experience as an Indian American, but unlike you, right, born in the United States to Indian parents who migrated here 40, 50 years ago. And when I talk to people of that generation, there is really a sense that, Modi has finally put India on the map. We immigrated to this country, the United States, because there was a lack of opportunity. We were fed up. We thought this was the promised land. And now many of the grievances that we've had are being addressed, right? And I think there's a third factor that comes in, and it's hard to know exactly how to rank order these, but I think this third one is quite important, which is where you sit is where you stand, right? The majority of Indian Americans happen to be Hindu. Of course, Hindus are the overwhelming majority in India. And so I do think that to a certain extent, they view politics in India very differently than how they think about politics in the United States, where, of course, both Hindus and Indian Americans more generally are a very, very small minority.
And in this sense, I think your last explanation also makes a lot of sense once I started reading the later parts of the report
Mm-hmm.
on specific questions with respect to, the Citizenship Amendment Act, the NRC, and so on. And Indian Americans overwhelmingly support some of these policies that you would normally imagine those voting for the Democratic Party in the United States would not be in favor of, right? So this is like a national registry for citizens across India, which has, of course, been incredibly controversial because it tends to leave out a very large percentage of Muslims, especially when it is read in conjunction with the Citizenship Amendment Act, which favors certain religious groups from abroad over others. And, also on the issue of caste-based affirmative action, right? So the way Indian Americans think about affirmative action in the United States, where they are a minority, is quite different from the way they think about affirmative action in India, where they were the majority.
Yeah, I think the kind of animating question, Shruti, was, can the same person have divergent views on the same issues when considered in different contexts, or do individuals and their policy attitudes remain stable across countries and contexts? Now, it's a kind of tricky thing to try to empirically do. So what we did, just to give your listeners a sense, was we essentially asked respondents about a set of contentious policy debates that are very much salient today in India, like you mentioned, the Citizenship Amendment Bill, the National Registry of Citizens, protests against the citizenship law, of course, which roiled India last year, affirmative action, and the use of defamation and sedition to try to silence critics of the Modi regime. Now, what's interesting about those issues is that they have their natural analogs in an American context, right? When it comes to protest, there's a big debate in the United States about police force against BLM protesters, Black Lives Matter protesters. There is a similarly robust debate about affirmative action about racial minorities here, right? So we polled them on how they view these issues in India, how they view them in the United States, and then a third time, just generically, what do you think about affirmative action, not specific to India or specific to the United States, but what do you think about the concept in general as a way to remedy historic discrimination? What do you think about generically the idea of police force against those who are peacefully protesting the state? And what we found, I think, was really interesting, which was in most cases, you find the most support for the kind of democratic norm in the abstract, right? Everybody loves the idea of you should treat all members of every religious group equally, right? You should absolutely protect the media from government censorship. But then you start to see this divergence where they're much less supportive, although still pretty supportive of a lot of these norms in the US context, but really more conservative on these issues when it comes to life back in India. So, just to give you an example, 90% of respondents say, yes, in the abstract, we support treating members of religious groups equally. When you ask that in a US context, that support comes down to 60%, and it comes down to below 50% in the Indian context. And so I think, just to tie this back to where we began, I do think part of this, we believe, has to do with one's majority status, right? And that changes or shapes their perspective of how they view these debates.
And in particular, the Republican Party has a small minority, which has been a very loud minority, which is, the white supremacists and the, Christian evangelical base and so on. And that kind of loud minority base of the Republican Party can also be very alienating to those who are immigrants in a new country, right? This goes back to what you said about where you sit is where you stand. So this elite group of Indians might feel like a minority or might feel discriminated against or threatened against, maybe for the first time in their lives.
I think this is really something that's quite important, Shruti. In our October report, where we asked more about US political attitudes, we specifically asked this question, that if you're an Indian American and you identify with the Democratic Party, why is it that you don't identify with the Republican Party? And it was so interesting that the number one response was because the Republican Party is fundamentally intolerant of minorities, number one. And number two is because it is too influenced by kind of right-wing Christian evangelicalism, right? So there is, I think, a general view in the Indian American community that we are not welcome inside the Republican Party. Now, obviously, that's a dominant view. It's not an absolute view. There are people who do, and we can think about people, the Indian Americans that we know who are prominent members of the party and their supporters. But I think when you think about averages right across the population, I think that feeling is quite stark.
And here I wanted to parse out the group, the Indian American group, into specific religions. For instance, can you tell us, how do Muslims feel about Modi versus the Republican Party, or BJP RSS versus the Republican Party on these issues relative to other Indian Americans who identify with, Hinduism, which is the majority religion in India, or Christians who may, feel a little more alliance with some of the policies of the Republican Party?
I think this, Shruti, is one of the most disconcerting findings, I would say, of our recent work. We know that politics in India has become increasingly polarized, and it has become increasingly polarized on many dimensions, but the religious cleavage perhaps is the most divisive. If you think about one cleavage that, unlike class, unlike caste, unlike region and language, could actually divide the country into two parts, it would be religion. And that kind of polarization is evident amongst members of the diaspora. So when you ask the simple question, do you approve of the job Narendra Modi has been doing as prime minister? Hindus are overwhelmingly supportive. Their net approval is around 40%, and it is negative 42 for Muslims. So they are fundamentally viewing the same political establishment through completely opposite lenses, right? And you can carry this forward through a number of other issues. How connected do you feel back to India? Muslims are much less likely to feel connected. Do you believe India is headed in the right direction, or has it gotten off track? Muslims are much more likely to believe it's off track. And on the issue that we just spoke about, how important or dangerous is religious majoritarianism in India, specifically Hindu majoritarianism? Hindus don't think it's as big of a threat as Muslims do it. Christians are somewhere in between, so their views are not quite as stark, but they're kind of split the difference, as it were, between these two. And so I think that was really sort of eye-opening, right? And so, Devesh and Sumitra and I, when we were talking about this, we were thinking about it, sort of that old saying about, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? What's happening in India is not staying in India. It's not confined to the four corners of the country. It's actually bleeding over into Indians abroad.
And here, I want to go back to a slightly bigger point, maybe, much beyond the survey results. This is about, the CAA NRC protests. I wrote, when they were happening a little more than a year ago, that we need to really think about the dissenters more carefully, because if you go back to, say, Hirschman's, voice, exit, and loyalty, those who tend to use voice also tend to be much more loyal, right? Those who are like critiquing the government as opposed to just exiting the system. And in one sense, the Indian Americans, especially because 2/3 of them, arrived between 2000 and 2018, they are the exiters, right? They have left India. And, if you go back to Hirschman, probably have a lot less skin in the game, are far less loyal than the dissenters who are actually protesting in India. Do you think that has something to do with why they have this, overwhelmingly positive image of the government, even though in abstract they disagree with some of these policies?
Certainly that has something to do with it. I think the other thing, and here I'm drawing on more, again, my kind of qualitative observation, is there are a number of Indian Americans who are not necessarily following the ins and outs of Indian politics in the way that you and I do, because this is our job. This is what we do for our living, right? I mean, we kind of live and breathe this stuff 24/7. And so they're kind of looking at the broad trajectory. And one of the things I've noticed, and I think there's a real parallel between Indians in India and Indian Americans, is they are willing to give Narendra Modi and his party and his government very wide latitude to say, look, he is trying to shake up the system in such a way that there's bound to be some china broken, right? And so if you're asking him to undo 65 years of deeply embedded history, he's not going to do it in 5 years, right? And so he may make missteps like demonetization. He may push the envelope too far on an issue like CAA, but he'll correct, right? We have to assess his performance maybe not even after 2 terms, but after 3 terms, right? And so I do think there's also a certain amount of, I guess you could say, sort of low information or medium information Indian Americans, and who are kind of looking at the medium to long term, right? Not obsessed so much with every twist and turn of this government.
Yeah, and I think in some sense we might lose the broad heuristic that these Indian Americans are using, the way you just said, that you and I are probably too close to the picture. It's probably too fuzzy for us to have such clean, broad views on the government. I doubt you and I would be good survey participants, on a questionnaire like this, because we would just start going into the very, very specific details that, oh, we agree with this, but we don't agree with that, and so on. Another interesting caricature, and this is, of course, just from, my interaction with other Indian Americans, is the typical Trump Modi supporter, who was probably there in Houston, right? Or at Madison Square Garden a few years before that, is like a slightly older generation, maybe, 50 plus, middle-aged uncle. It's always a man. I don't know why the stereotype is always the man from New Jersey or something like that. Like, there's a very specific idea of who these people are. Does that pan out at all? Or is this just across the board? It's young people, old people, college going, business, and I assume well beyond New Jersey.
Yeah, exactly. Or Houston, Texas, which is where I'm from. So I think there is certainly some truth to some of these stereotypes, not fully, but in large measure. So let me just give you kind of a couple of demographic cuts, right? The age divide is quite striking. If you are in the lowest age category, that is people below the age of 30, 18 to 29, you are much more likely to disapprove than approve of Modi. And that is the only age category where that is true. If you're 30 and above, in fact, 30 to 50 and 50 and above are almost identical in terms of their support for Modi. We mentioned already the kind of religious divide between Hindus and Muslims, Christians in between. Of course, we also discuss, Republicans are slightly more inclined, although Democrats certainly aren't negative by any stretch. There is a very clear regional pattern. And when I mean regional as in the region of origin that Indian Americans are from. So Modi's support is greatest amongst Hindi speakers, so people who come from the kind of heartland states, right? UP, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, so on, and from the West. So those are Gujarati and Marathi speakers. Much, much lower support in the South, and the lowest, in fact, in the East. So these are places like Bengal and Orissa and others. So I think some of those stereotypes are certainly true. However, you think of men, right? We mentioned this before. There's actually no gender gap that we were sort of able to ascertain. Length of time you've been in the country, right? We think of, it's the people who have been here forever, they love Modi. In fact, it is the people who have been here the shortest amount of time and the people who have been here the oldest amount of time that have the greatest issues with Modi. It's sort of the middle section of people who kind of maybe came 10 years ago, right? So people like my parents' generation, who, my parents immigrated here in the late 1960s, their generation actually has more mixed views about Modi. And there could be a number of reasons why. They left India at a time of Congress dominance, right? That is what they knew. More recent arrivals, obviously, are coming from a very changed political context.
Why is any of this important? But why is the Indian diaspora so important? I mean, it's just 4 million people, right? In a country where they reside is about 300 million plus. The country that they came from is 1.35 billion. But it feels like this small group has this outsized impact, right? Now, is this because the Pravasi Bharat PR exercise is so big? It started with Vajpayee, but it's been going strong for a while. Is it because actually the campaign contributions, which is another one of your areas of expertise, are very strong, though I imagine they can't be that big when you compare it to the size of India? Or is it because of, what Alex Tabarrok and I have written about in terms of, the elites in the US are in a sense a very strong focal point or anchor point for the elites in India. And there's a lot of premature imitation of policies based on what's happening in the US. There's almost like an Indian elite that lives in America, like the bubble of America within India. So what is the reason this group has such an important influence back in India?
And I think, the starting point is what you said, which is their numbers are not that big, right? We're talking about 1% roughly of the US population, about 4.2 million. Now, a couple of things I'll say. Number one is that number may be small, but it's growing very rapidly, right? So it's grown by 150% from 2000 to 2018. It is now the second largest immigrant group in America. In particular states, thinking about it from a US political context, battleground states, New Hampshire, Michigan, Florida, Pennsylvania, Indian Americans are large enough to cover the margin of victory between winners and losers, right? Which means, of course, they don't all vote as a block, but they're sizable enough actually where political parties now are starting to mobilize to try to win their vote. You mentioned the money bit. The money bit matters in the US context increasingly. The Los Angeles Times did a study during the primary season, which found that Indian Americans collectively contributed more money to presidential races than Hollywood did, right? So we're starting to see them use some of their economic influence and channelize that into politics. But I think the third reason is that, Indian American community has been seen as a bridge builder between the United States and India. When you think about the sea change in the relationship between the US and India since about the year 2000, right? So the last 2 decades. An important part of that has been the Indian American community advocating, lobbying for things like the US-India civil nuclear deal, advocating for greater trade ties and kind of economic people-to-people, looser immigration, so on and so forth. So I think it matters not just in a US domestic political context. I think it matters a lot for foreign policy. And I think what's so interesting about Modi's approach is when Modi does something like Madison Square Garden, or he does something like Howdy Modi, where you get 50,000 screaming fans packing a football stadium in Houston, he's not just signaling to his own domestic audience back home, he's also signaling to US politicians,
Yes.
to governors, to members of Congress, to senators, to the president who was desperate to share a stage with him, saying, these people are now in their moment has arrived. And of course, also flexing a little muscle, say, I actually have some influence over them. So, you need to pay attention to them because, and pay attention to me by extension. And I think, that kind of phenomenon is only going to grow and increase in my view.
Do you think it's going to impact some specific policies? For instance, one of the really important issues is immigration, right? Do you think the Democrats are going to be more likely, for instance, to remove country caps on green cards, which I know is a huge issue with the not yet citizens subgroup within Indian Americans? Or do you think it's going to translate into particular kinds of action when it comes to Asian Americans, lawsuits against Ivy League schools and them facing discrimination and so on? Do you think it'll translate into these specific issues, or do you think this group is just too small for that?
No, I actually think it's going to translate at least in 3 ways, right? I think first is Indian Americans, of course, working on their own, but as well as working with other Asian American interest groups, or API groups as they're known, Asian American Pacific Islander, are certainly lobbying very hard to address some of the curbs to immigration, including high-skilled immigration, right? Which, Indians have been the poster child for those liberal visa regimes, right? And so I think in terms of reversing some of those, I think they're going to be very animated and actually, throw their weight around a little bit. I think number 2 is we are seeing, and, Shruti, I've been living in Washington now on and off since the year 2002.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know. Exactly. Our mutual friend, Ruben Abraham, always offers me condolences when I mention that fact. I have never seen Indian Americans or Asian Americans as exercised about representation in a new administration as I have this time around. I mean, we are seeing just a constant stream of, we need to have an Asian person who's in the cabinet. We need to make sure that Indians and other Asians are represented. I don't even remember hearing that same kind of lobbying in the same way, 4 years ago, 8 years ago. I think the third way in which this is going to matter, and again, coming back to some of the policy preferences, is one thing that the State Department knows. If they decide to criticize some of Mr. Modi's policies on Kashmir, on human rights, on democratic backsliding, is they are going to hear from their Indian American friends in the United States very loudly, right? And I think that is a factor. It's undeniable that they are very worried about sort of backlash from that community and how that then gets refracted through financial contributions, Capitol Hill, diplomacy, and so on and so forth. So it's not only about influencing things that happen, it's also about influencing things that don't happen.
Absolutely. What surprised you the most about this particular survey and the results?
I think two or three things. I think one is I was really struck. I think we were all struck by, again, how poorly the Congress Party and Rahul Gandhi fare. It just mirrors the diminution of the Congress Party in India in terms of the diaspora's views. And of course, the two are related, right? I mean,
Yes.
Obviously, if the party is suffering there, it's unlikely to be doing that well amongst the diaspora. There's a lot of two-way transmission. But that to me was really stunning. Again, given the fact that we know that Indian Americans veer kind of left of center. So I think that was the first surprising factor. The second surprising factor was, there was just a lot of talk in the run up to the United States 2020 presidential election that Indian Americans were getting very antsy with the Democratic Party. And that because of the Modi-Trump kind of bromance or camaraderie, and the fact that many Indian Americans were worried about what a Biden-Harris administration might mean for India, more clampdown on democracy, human rights, and kind of harming U.S.-India relations, that they would move to the Republican Party. We didn't see two things. One, we didn't see a wide-scale defection to the Republicans, but number two, Indian American voters, by and large, were just not animated by foreign policy and by U.S.-India relations. And this is the thing that, I have a lot of disagreements with some of my Indian American friends about, who care a lot about this stuff. And I'm saying, again, I think it's a little bit of a bubble. I actually think if you go out and talk to Indian Americans who are in, Illinois and California, they care about the bread and butter stuff that most Americans care about, right? They care about the coronavirus and getting the vaccine.
Yeah.
They care about, their incomes going down. They care about their kids stuck at home and not in schools, right? So I think is still, to me, I think a relative elite level concern.
Yeah, and also there may be a difference in terms of what people talk about when they meet other Indians. So, your views and mine might be skewed because the moment we meet each other, we zero in on these topics of, Kashmir or China or, Modi. Like you said, you care about all these basic things: healthcare, immigration, economy, taxes, even more local stuff than ever before.
It's not just, I don't mean to imply in any sense that Indian Americans don't care about what's happening back in India and don't care about foreign policy. I think they do. And you ask them, is this important to you? It's absolutely important. But there's a difference between saying, I care, this is important, to when I go and cast my ballot.
Exactly.
What's the rank order of things that I'm choosing? And, 3% of Indian Americans put U.S.-India relations. Now, I will point out that there is some variation, right? So I think if you are born in India and immigrate here, you put a greater weight on that than if you are a second generation like me, who was born in the United States, and you tend to view yourself as more American than Indian and maybe slightly less connected on average. You downweight foreign policy even further.
I noticed one curious thing which surprised me. There's a lot more unity on the China question, or rather the disapproval of China, than I had anticipated earlier. I didn't think that since they are so polarized on every other question, that they would be so united as a group in their criticism of China.
Yeah, we just asked a kind of simple question that, Pew and Gallup and a bunch of other surveys asked, which is, what's your opinion of China? Are you very favorable, somewhat unfavorable, and so on and so forth? And 2/3 of Indian Americans hold unfavorable views towards India's large neighbor, China. And, I think recent events probably have something to do with that, right? I mean, I do think, and I don't know if you agree with me or not, but in the post-COVID era, views on China have become very, very polarized, right? I do think the mood has shifted. Plus, of course, things that have happened back in India with Chinese kind of aggression along the border, other things that have happened elsewhere in Asia, I think sort of feed into this. But where there is discrepancy or divergence is on what to do about it.
Yes.
Should the United States strengthen India militarily as a hedge or as a balance against China? Generally, Indian Americans say yes, but those born in the United States, those who are younger, those who are Democrats are much more cautious,
Yeah.
right? That maybe we shouldn't do things that are going to provoke China to react in an aggressive manner. Where, again, those born in India, Republicans, more conservative minded folks are much more gung ho saying, now's our time to press our advantage and really put China in the box. So while views on China may not be that polarized, there is still a lot of difference in what to do about it, right? So that kind
Yeah.
of so what question.
Absolutely. But even the views about China being polarized surprised me because Indian Americans identify so closely with other Asian Americans. They typically tend to live in the same neighborhoods. Typically, children of both these groups are the highest performing, in their classrooms and so on. So I just thought there would be a lot more confusion on the China matter.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess, you think of individuals very differently than you think of geopolitics or, the country, or rather maybe even the party, right? In the case of China, because of coronavirus and so many other things like that.
Yeah, and just a final thing is that the survey was fielded in the month of September 2020, and my guess is that people were really reeling. Remember, I mean, we're still reeling from the coronavirus, sadly, here in spring of 2021, but certainly in the fall of 2020, right? I mean, things looked very, very bleak.
How do you think about this, sort of Indian Americans going forward, right? Is this a group that we need to treat as a group? Is it high time that we started, parsing out subgroup details as you've seen from your survey results? Like those who are policymakers, those who are in the Democratic Party, for whom this is a huge, voting constituency, how should they think about this group longer term?
I think one of the things that we've tried to highlight, really for the benefit of audiences in India and the government of India, is the Indian diaspora that you have become accustomed to is not necessarily going to be the Indian diaspora of the future, right? The rate at which the ranks of the second generation are growing, and they've also been growing relative to the first generation because of immigration curbs, right? So at least during the Trump era, we saw many fewer people coming from India. So the proportion started to change. They have very different views. One of the interesting things I found was we asked people about who'd you vote for in the presidential primaries. If you're born in the United States, much more likely to vote for Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, right? And so, yes, Biden still was the most popular choice of first and second generation Indian Americans. But if you look below that, you see the kind of progressive left have much more of a foothold amongst the younger and the second generation. I think that's going to have an impact both on their domestic policy preferences as well as their foreign policy preferences. But I do think, we have thought of this group as kind of more or less operating with a clarity of purpose, advancing U.S.-India relations as being a kind of backstop. But in fact, there are groups in the diaspora who are now advocating very strongly and vociferously, not for stronger U.S.-India relations, but actually to reverse the trajectory of U.S.-India relations, saying, we need to put a stop or put a curb on what Modi is doing and what his party is doing. Of course, a lot of that gets strength from minority communities, namely Muslims. But there's also something else, I think, which is quite interesting, which the survey didn't have enough statistical power to go into, but I think is related to this question. There are relatively few Sikhs in the United States, and so they're very small, less than 5% of our sample. But I was talking with a Sikh friend of mine who's an academic who was saying one of the things that they've picked up in thinking about the Sikh population is many of them have become so disaffected with India. This is predating the farmer protests, that they have stopped identifying as Indian.
Oh, wow.
They identify as Sikh. And in fact, there was a lobbying effort for the US Census to make Sikh an ethnic category, which has succeeded. And so separate from sort of, Asian Indian. I don't know how widespread that feeling is, but I think that's another cleavage that we don't even pay much attention to. We're so focused on the kind of Hindu-Muslim divide.
No, absolutely. And, this is starting to look a lot more like India, which is what is so fascinating to me about the entire survey, right? The typical reductive NRI Indian, once you start picking at it is not so typical and not so reductive anymore. I want to shift focus away from like Indian American views on the Indian state to
Mm.
your views on the Indian state in particular. And I'm talking about a recent paper that you wrote with Madhav Khosla in the Journal of Democracy. And you describe the recent emergence of the Indian state in three parts. You say, there's a dominant ethnic state, there's a dominant sort of absolute or rather centralized controlling state, and there's an opacity in the new version or the new emergence of the Indian state. Can you just tell me, in broad brushstrokes, how you think about the Indian state and these categories in particular?
Yeah. So, I think since 1947 or 1950, when the Constitution was ratified, there has been a sense that there is this consolidated framework for thinking about how democracy can flourish in one of the most diverse, in some ways unhospitable, because of all of the cleavages for democracy, for liberal democracy. But despite all the odds, we all know the story, right? How India has been able to kind of sustain this kind of democratic form of governance. And, what we started to realize through a series of conversations and things that we had read is, this stable constitutional structure that has been associated with certain features, free and fair elections, equal citizenship, kind of horizontal and vertical checks and balances, a strong independent judiciary, something that you study, Shruti. All of these now have come under a cloud, right? So both because of legal changes as well as equally critical kind of changes in norms, right, and informal practices, we now have the emergence of what we call, a triple state, which is the rise of an ethnic state in which religion is increasingly being seen as a prism through which citizenship and belonging are defined, the absolute state, which is a kind of concentration of executive power in the person of the prime minister and the prime minister's office, to the detriment both of kind of federal differences as well as kind of, horizontal checks and independent institutions. And then the last was this idea of the rise of an opaque state, which is, I think sometimes we forget that there has been a very hard fought battle with quite a number of important victories towards making the Indian state more transparent. We think about things like the Right to Information Act, of course, of 2005, the kind of opening up of government, data for the masses, the ability for ordinary Indians to peer into the everyday functioning of the state. Now, it's not been perfect. We all know that all of these systems have great flaws, right? But there was a kind of trickle of small victories over a 10 or 20 year period that led to, I think, some pretty important changes. Those things starting to kind of roll back. And so we kind of wanted to document these shifts. And I think where we depart from others who have looked at similar things is to take a slightly longer view, to say, not everything began in 2014 with the election of Mr. Modi. Many of these trends have accelerated, undoubtedly, and there have been qualitative shifts if you think about the ethnic state, for instance. But when it comes to the absolute state, the decline of parliament, the weakening of the judiciary, these are things, the seeds of which were planted a while ago, and they're now being sort of brought to fruition.
I completely agree with you on the ethnic state. I
Yeah.
want to push back a little bit on the other two.
Okay.
So, on the absolute state, my sense is there are some aspects of the centralizing tendencies that have ebbed and flowed. I agree with you that the anti-defection law, has been just devastating when it comes to parliamentary spirit and parliamentary norms and things like that. But we also know of Indira Gandhi's government, even pre-emergency, just passing constitutional amendments without much debate, sort of strong-arming Rajya Sabha to push through her favorite policies when it came to things like nationalization. I think another centralizing tendency, which has been there for a long time, but may have even ebbed now, is when it comes to the economy, right? So, the stronghold of price and quantity controls, the licensing regime, not allowing states to go their own way, the Finance Commission's extremely disparate split on the center state revenue. Now we are at about 40%, but that's still a very new trend in India, right? I mean, almost all of the revenues used to be in the hands of the center to control. So they really control the purse strings and therefore everything. So my sense is somehow that, these tendencies have always been there. One, that they just came up in maybe more economic control aspects rather than social and political control aspects, and two, that they have ebbed and flowed depending on which authoritarian we are talking about. So we've had authoritarians in the Congress party like Indira Gandhi, and we've had authoritarians on the other side like BJP. But when it comes to, say, Vajpayee, or when it comes to Manmohan Singh, or Lal Bahadur Shastri, you see a very similar trend irrespective of the decade. Would you agree with that, or do you think that is just it's difficult to take this long arc view if we start going into details like that?
No, a lot of validity to what you just said, Shruti, and it's hard for me to really disagree with any of it. One could make a slightly more provocative argument and basically say, are we just experiencing some kind of mean reversion, right? In other words, the period between 1989 and 2014, where it was the coalition era, the idea of a single political party dominating the political space was just anathema, right? And so you had this political fragmentation, which then opened up space for institutions, whether it's the courts, whether it's the election commission, whether it's the comptroller and auditor general, whether it's states, to kind of come in, because everyone was invested in and had incentives to cultivate a level playing field, because you could wake up tomorrow and be thrown out of power, and you don't want your rival who comes back into power to kind of, punish you. I think that's certainly true, right? Which is kind of political fragmentation and the absence of a ideologically driven ruling party, have really masked, I think, the degree to which India's democratic fortunes were somewhat kind of, we write in the piece, hostages to contingency, right?
Yeah.
And sort of relying more on kind of, the state's good behavior as opposed to kind of very solid legal institutional constraints. I think one could make that argument. It's harder to make, of course, with the ethnic state, right?
Yes.
Where I do think there is clearly an alignment between the emergence of a hegemonic party system and a very clear and widely shared ideology about, the way in which sort of religion and public life, right, and social life should be organized.
No, there I agree with you. In fact, I think it might be even worse than, I feel like you might have held back in the paper a bit, because from what I've learned from, the recent work that's done by Vinay Sitapati and things, and sort of literature like that, is now, earlier, we were kind of saved in quotation marks by caste cleavages, in the sense that, these regional parties that were very caste-based, had strongholds in their local areas, were a good pushback against sort of the majoritarian tendencies, either of the Congress or the BJP. And now the BJP has emerged as sort of the umbrella party, which wants to include all castes and linguistic differences. And the umbrella, therefore, is now Hinduism, right? So now we are much more reliant on the religious aspect of ethnic divisions than we were in the past, where, there was linguistic and regional and caste differences. But now we are really moving towards like quite a different India. On the opaque state, I wanted to push back again a little bit, because I mean, in one sense, I completely agree with what you write in the paper that, in terms of the Right to Information Act, a lot of the institutions, the fudging of the GDP data, things like this, there's no question that there has been a backslide. But are these just concerns of elites like you and me who are looking for data before we write our pieces? Because when we talk to voters, they actually think this government is a lot less corrupt and a lot more transparent, especially when it comes to last mile delivery of services, right? Like India has been famously the leaky bucket when it comes to delivery of, welfare entitlements and services. And it seems like one thing that Modi has done very well, or at least the perception is that his government has done very well, is that things that are promised to the constituents and the voters actually do reach them.
So undoubtedly, right, that's a part of his appeal. I think on the transparency bit, I think there's a divergence between kind of perception and reality, right? I think for many Indians, rightly believe that between demonetization and electoral bonds, Modi's actually done kind of wonders for transparency and say political funding, right? Where I think you and I would probably have a very, very different view. But that's where I think they have managed to package up reforms in such a way that appear to be big wins, even the audacity to introduce electoral bonds under the heading of improving transparency in election finance is takes a lot of chutzpah. And it's almost similar to actually, the analogy I'd make on the political side is to caste, right? I think for many Indians, what has been so great about Mr. Modi is that his appeals have transcended caste, right? That he doesn't play the same kind of caste politics at some of the Mundal parties like the Samajwadi Party. But in fact, the key to understanding the way in which the BJP has been able to take over the Hindi heartland is premised on mobilizing along caste divisions. They may be new caste divisions, but they're caste divisions nonetheless, right? Just as a bit of an aside, right? There was always this line that stuck with me about the difference between Lalu Prasad and Nitish Kumar, right? And it was that, for Nitish Kumar, caste is in the subtext of everything that he does, right? Who he gives tickets to, how he stacks the bureaucracy. For Lalu Prasad, it was the text and the subtext, right? So the subtext remains the same. It's just the outward sort of presentation, right? Which I think. Now, welfare, I think it's not so much about transparency, but more about trying to reorient people's view of the state from something that was uncaring, unfeeling, unresponsive to something that every once in a while actually does something that's of value, right? It is interesting, just to go back to the kind of absolute state, the way in which you've been able to do that is basically to run it from the top, right?
Yes.
You don't want to make these programs truly decentralized programs, because then that doesn't allow you as the prime minister to claim credit. And I think one of Modi's most brilliant political masterstrokes has been to say, I'm going to invest in these things which are objectively good for people's welfare, but I'm going to do it in ways that everybody knows that it came from me.
Yes.
And so therefore, no state government, no local government, no opposition party can credibly claim that they're getting, water, electricity, cooking gas because they delivered it.
Yeah, and this used to be the playbook of the Congress, right? Naming everything, Jawahar Rozgar Yojana and, things like that. But now I think the BJP has taken that playbook and just improved it and mastered it when it comes to taking credit for any welfare expenditure that takes place in India. What do you think about the long-term view of the BJP? Are you also of the view that this party is here to stay simply because the electoral math looks that way? I mean, they go and campaign in Hyderabad municipal elections. They go and campaign in the Northeast, which was this area that, no major national leaders used to go and campaign in. Or do you think, these things ebb and flow, and before you know it, the switch will flip and some regional parties will come together and start pushing back as it happened with the Congress?
So I think there's a kind of short-term, long-term perspective. In the short term, it is very hard to see how this juggernaut is curbed at the national level. State elections will come and go. It's quite likely in the coming set, they may lose quite a few of them. But I have no doubt that if we were to have a parliamentary election this year or next year, that the BJP would come back probably with the same kind of majority that it enjoyed in 2019, which is, frankly, quite an achievement, right? Despite economic crisis, China invasion on their borders, right? I mean, to be able to sustain that kind of popularity. However, I do think that some of the contradictions and liabilities in their approach will eventually come back to question this authority. So one is, just as what happened with the Congress, they were able to create quite powerful caste and community combinations of support, but that then never translated into representation and political power, right? So we start to see some of this in the Dalit community saying, you've become the de facto party of Dalits, but where are we in the kind of party hierarchy? So I think that's certainly one. I think the second, again, is that, people have given a long leash to engineer an economic turnaround. But I mean, I think one has to be quite honest and objective in saying that in 7 years, that has not taken off, right? And it is one thing in your first term to blame your predecessor government for giving you this horrible legacy that they inherited, and they did inherit an economic mess. But it's much harder to say that now that you've been in power for 7 years, right? So
and also you've had your own blunders like demonetization and GST, and of course now the pandemic.
You've had your own blunders. And then third is that, we once all thought, or, people thought that kind of Indira Gandhi and her pop was kind of invincible. And I think there undoubtedly is a danger in Narendra Modi remaking the BJP in his own image, because if for whatever reason his popularity wanes, that then casts the entire party in crisis. One of the brilliant things about the BJP in the 2000s, and people like Pratap Bhanu Mehta and others wrote about this, is that it really wasn't a single national party. It was a collection of regional parties. Of course, they had a common ideological affinity, the connection to the Sangh, but you had in Shivraj Singh and Narendra Modi and Yediyurappa and others, powerful chieftains who had autonomous. A lot of that is gone, right? There is no chief minister in the BJP today who is not there because Mr. Modi placed him there.
Absolutely.
And I do think that in the long term could be a problem, but certainly doesn't appear to be in the short run at all.
I very much agree with you there, that sometimes when the person becomes the party, it's the beginning of the end in the very long arc, right? It's the Caesar effect sort of that creeps into party politics. And BJP used to be a very democratic party famously. And even that tendency seems to be, ebbing. The party itself has become more centralized. Its intra-party democracy has certainly weakened, I believe, under the Modi Shah regime, or at least from what I read. And yeah, you're right. In the long run, these things will definitely matter.
Well, Shruti, just to, sorry, one more thing on that is, just as a kind of anecdote, right, for your listeners. I mean, here we are. Yesterday, the world's biggest cricket stadium was renamed for Prime Minister Modi, right? And I think there were a lot of BJP partisans who came on the evening news channels and were appalled.
Yeah.
They were appalled because it's not something you do when you're still alive. But secondly, it's what the Congress always did.
Yes.
And if you want to say that you're not just a different party, but a party with a difference, then replicating the same excesses of the party, which is now sunk to great depths, is probably not a very savvy move, right?
And I was horrified on two counts. One, so this wasn't one of the erstwhile Congress names or even the British names that they decided to change and, Indianize it. The other thing that, as a public choice economist, I found delicious and also horrifying is that the two pavilions in the stadium are named after Adani and Ambani. And that takes a particular kind of arrogance.
Yeah,
and to think that you can get away with that.
Well, it feeds into the thing I think the BJP is rightly concerned about, going back to Rahul Gandhi's famous "Soot Boot Ki Sarkar" jibe, right, of being seen as kind of cronyist or crony capitalist, and how in today's India that creates a liability. So it was interesting to sort of lean into many of these things that we thought were kind of verboten.
I want to ask you a few questions about you now. You're trained as a political scientist and you follow Indian politics like just probably more closely than virtually anyone else I know. So what led you to this point? Like, what is your intellectual journey that got you to this point of staying up at all odd hours and reading about Indian newspapers and Twitter to follow Indian politics?
Yeah, well, the truth, if I'm being perfectly honest, it has been a very wayward and non-linear path. I was always interested in political science and international relations, and that's what I studied as an undergrad. After undergrad, I came to Washington. I worked here for a few years before doing a PhD. But even as a PhD student in my early years, had no thought or desire of studying India. I think as the kind of child of immigrants, I think sometimes there's a kind of natural knee-jerk reaction to shun the thing that you are, right? So it's too predictable. It's not exotic enough. And I worked on India, already know that. And it wasn't really until I started to do my PhD work and I got interested in kind of questions of democracy and governance. And I thought, my God, right? I mean, India really is kind of ground zero. And I was probably, I was in my mid 20s, so I had matured a little to understand that why I had a cultural affinity towards India. I didn't really know the country in any meaningful sense. So that kind of light bulb went off, and you've been there. So, you're staring at the next 4 or 5 years of your life and, what's going to be personally fulfilling? Where do you want to spend time? Where do you want to travel? And it just kind of India sort of kind of bubbled up. And, obviously, we're biased. We work on India, but it's hard for me to think of really a more fascinating country in the world where you will be a perennial student, right? You will just never become an expert on it because it's too vast and too complicated and too nuanced and too heterogeneous. And I sort of like that challenge, right? I mean, I think, you come to the breakfast table every day and you're like, there are 25 things that are going on that I don't understand. and I want to get to the bottom of. So in that sense, there's never a dull moment.
And growing up, and you grew up in Houston, you were born and raised there.
Yeah.
What were the influences that either nudged you towards India or against, away from India rather, in your early years?
I grew up in a pretty conventional kind of middle class, Gujarati household. My father's an architect. My mom was in the sciences. And I owe a great debt, I think, to my brother, who was 5 years older than me, who knew from the age of 5 or 6 that he wanted to be a writer. And he was editor of his school newspaper. He went to journalism school. He was a newspaper reporter for, 12 or 15 years. And that was a shock to everybody's system because, growing up in the 80s, it's just not what you did as an Indian, right? I mean, it's not what any of his friends did. It's not what most of our cousins did. They were doing medicine or business or engineering. But that actually opened up space for me. And the influence was very direct, which was in our household, the first thing you did every morning was you read the newspaper. You read every section from sports to the front page to business to metro. And I started doing that from a very young age. And that was what triggered really the interest in politics. Now, when I studied that stuff in college, I didn't know you could have a career doing that, right? I just thought it was like a hobby that you do before you go to law school. But then over time, through a series of kind of experiences, realize, wow, like you could actually do this and make a living out of it. And so once I sort of put 2 and 2 together, there was no turning back. And I think thankfully my brother had paved the way. So my parents, when it came to me, it's just like, okay, whatever. Political science couldn't be worse than journalism. And in fact, maybe the one field that is worse than journalism, but I didn't tell them that.
But you can get a PhD in political science, and most people don't do that in journalism. So you have a little bit of status in the Indian community, right? For what it's worth, you are Dr. Vaishnav.
That's right. I did spend 23 years in school. So
one, of course, now it makes sense, your early habits of reading, but you write very broadly. You write, academic papers. Your book is fantastic. I've read and reviewed it. You write these kinds of policy reports or, like the report that we just discussed. You, of course, write in newspapers and so on. So what is your writing process for each of these? Is it different? Is it the same?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think the first thing is that, I came into this job at Carnegie 8.5 years ago, with not a huge amount of experience doing public writing. I had a fair amount, but one of the things I realized, first of all, just is that how much better one gets through practice, right? And sort of now the process of putting together an op-ed, if the idea is there, is relatively kind of straightforward. Shruti, I tend to write in intense sort of bursts. I kind of have one of these obsessive compulsive personalities where once an idea is kind of stuck in my craw, it's actually very hard for me to do anything else. And so I have to kind of get it out. It's never in its final form, right? It's almost like you're kind of throwing this up on a page and then you've got to kind of work on it. So I've been very reluctant, for instance, to agree to doing a regular column because I don't find that my brain works on that kind of rhythm of like naturally every week, every 2 weeks, I have something to say, right? So I may go through a period where it's like, oh my God, I have all this stuff. And ideas really do tend to kind of marinate, for quite a long time. And I'm kind of, working them out and talking to people and, making little notes. And then it kind of all comes in one go, which is why I think, it can be it's sort of a challenge doing, longer form stuff, right? Because you really, that's something that it's hard to just do in all one go. You have to break it up into bite-sized pieces. So I think the only way I was able to kind of write my first book was psychologically thinking about it, not as a book, but rather as a series of kind of short articles that were then going to be kind of appended together. Because otherwise, I just think it was just too daunting and overwhelming for me to kind of think of that. And I'm just last thing I'll say is, I've been very lucky working at a think tank that cares a lot about long form work and academic writing and policy writing, is that I've been kind of given the space to sort of dabble in a lot of different things. And that's a real luxury, right? I mean, sometimes, you're forced to do kind of one or the other. And I've been maybe not perfectly, but tried to kind of still straddle a kind of more research-based life and a kind of policy-based life.
Do you write every day? Do you listen to music while you write?
Yes, I have to listen to music. That's like a must. So there are two things that I think have totally revolutionized my life. So one is Spotify and the second is Dropbox. And I don't honestly know how I worked without those two kind of apps on my computer and my phone. It's all changed, right? Because we're all at home I'm coming up on my 1 year anniversary, probably you too, of working from home. And so now it's very different, but I tend to need really long stretches. It's in fact, one of the most difficult things about working from home is that I kind of need to be sort of locked away for 6 or 8 hours to really focus on something. There's some people I know who they'll take 15 minutes. You're in a taxi and they'll break out their iPad and start typing, and like I can't I'll just waste my time checking email or Twitter or something. But I do have 2 dogs, and the one thing that working from home requires is a lot of dog walking. So I go for an hour-long walk in the morning, and I either listen to books or I talk to people in India, or I just kind of clear my head. And that's actually been super useful for just the kind of creative process, I think.
Yeah, no, I have very similar views on my reliance on coffee, Dropbox, Spotify, dogs. Everything needs to be in a particular like configuration, and then I can work and like things start happening. What are some of the big projects you're working on right now?
So this Indian American work is not over. We have a third report coming out hopefully in April, May, and that's the third in this series, and that's going to look at kind of the social realities and social identities of Indian Americans. So how do they identify? Do they think of themselves as more Indian or more American? What are their social networks like? Who do they marry? Are they marrying Indians or non-Indians? Are they victims of discrimination? How much discrimination do they perceive being thrust upon the Indian American community? So it's kind of how they live, as it were. So that's what we're kind of working on now.
We got a little glimpse of that in this one, right? They do watch a lot of Indian movies and eat a lot of Indian food.
They do, yeah.
Irrespective of which subgroup.
Including people of the second generation, which did surprise me is culturally that there was that affinity there. The three of us are so excited by this. We're kind of thinking through all sorts of extensions, including wanting to repeat this going forward so then we can start to track over time, say in 2022 when we have a midterm election, next presidential election. But I think there's also a natural comparative project with Devesh and Sumitra and I have been kicking around, which is, if you think about just one contrast, Indians in the UK versus Indians in the United States, what we know from the data that's out there, that Indians in the UK have in fact moved much closer to the Conservative Party and away from the Labour Party. So the kind of thing we thought would happen in the United States has actually happened there. So what is it about the way in which Indian in the UK are viewing things that has led to this kind of divergence? So that's one. The second, in fact, is related to this piece in the Journal of Democracy where Madhav Khosla, my co-author, and I are actually going to try to build on this a little bit more, potentially for sort of another book, but really dig into in greater detail how these 3 states, as we call them, have sort of emerged, right? I think we didn't really get into that. We talked about their manifestations and their consequences.
Yeah.
But we haven't done a lot of thinking about, well, how did we get to this place, right? For instance, why has secularism become such a 4-letter word and become discredited such that it created the space for the ethnic state to sort of rise, right? You mentioned anti-defection law. I mean, that's clearly one piece of it. I think, what you study, the judiciary, is an equally fascinating question, right?
Absolutely.
This is not a case, unlike other countries, where there has been a straightforward executive takeover of the justice system. It has been much more subtle.
It's creeping.
It has been creeping, but is it because of executive interference in appointments? Maybe. Is it because of the career incentives, right, of judges kind of reading the sort of tea leaves and then adjusting, thinking about what jobs they're going to get after? I think there's a range of things that we don't kind of fully understand. So yeah, so I think there's going to be plenty to keep me busy for a long, long time.
And finally, I know you've been listening to a lot of Bruce Springsteen through the pandemic, because I read this lovely piece that you wrote about him and his music. But what else have you been doing? Have you been binge watching a lot of TV? Because that seems like that's all I have done.
Yeah, well, so we have two children. We have two daughters. So we're all the four of us and our two dogs at home. So we spend a lot of family time together, which has actually been one of the saving graces of this whole pandemic. But my wife loves to cook, and I increasingly like to cook. And I find that I like it more now that I'm not under the stress of having to do it in like 30 minutes racing home from work, when I have kind of more time. We have been binge watching a lot. We've gotten into kind of sort of the kind of thriller police procedural genre on Netflix and Amazon Prime. So we just finished a series called Dublin Murder, which is actually based on a series of books that we both enjoyed by this Irish author called Tana French. And the series, it was on Stars or something, but you can just buy it on Amazon Prime, is a kind of melding together of two of her books into, this 10-part series. But books actually have been, I think, the big winner. So the third app, Shruti, in addition to Dropbox and Spotify, which has revolutionized my life, which I pass on to you as my only bit of wisdom, is the public library has an app called Libby. I don't know if you use this. Basically, you can get as an audiobook or as a digital book, virtually anything you want. You may have to wait for it if someone else is using it. But I have read more books in 2020 than I think I probably read in the 3 or 4 years combined. And I think audiobooks are a big part of that, because now, when I'm out doing exercise or cooking dinner or whatever, I'll just put it in and get, half an hour. And, the millennials have taught me that you can listen to these things at, 1.5 times or 1.75. So now I get more, more bang for the buck. That really has been the pandemic revelation for me.
Thank you, Milan. This was such a pleasure. Thank you for doing this.
No, thanks for having me, and look forward to many more podcasts to come, Shruti.
Thanks for listening to Ideas of India. If you enjoy this podcast, please help us grow by sharing with like-minded friends. You can connect with me on Twitter at @SRajagopalan. In the next episode of Ideas of India, I speak with Himanshu Jha on institutional change, transparency, and corruption.